So welcome back. This is going to be screencast number 1 for chapter 25, and we are finally going to be discussing animals that have finally made their way out of the water. And this very large group of animals is often referred to as tetrapods. And if you notice, we have the prefix tetra, and tetra is going to refer to four. And so when they talk about four, in this case, they're talking about an animal that in most cases is going to have four limbs. Now for chapter 25, we're talking about a tetrapod that has just made its way out of the water, and this particular group is called the amphibians. And the reason we know that they're still somewhat connected to the water is if you look at the prefix on this particular word, amphi, it actually refers to an organism that still needs to have some sort of a connection to water. And in most cases with this group, that connection is in regards either to respiration or of course to reproduction. Now amphibians as a group again are one of the first groups that have transitioned onto land, and so there were some physical adaptations that had to occur in order for this to happen. One of them was their ability to obtain oxygen. Now, in this case, when you're looking at an animal that's on land, in air, oxygen is about 20 times more abundant in air than it was in water. And so if that is the case, you have a lot more available to you. So what you need to do is you need to adapt or change the way that you actually obtain that oxygen. And in most cases, the animals in this group and future groups have possessed some sort of respiratory structure. In most cases, we call that structure a lung. Now the density of air is about 1,000 times less dense than you would find in water. So because of this, you don't really need a structure that would provide you with the buoyancy that was necessary in a water type of environment. But what you do need is you do need some sort of structure that's going to support that additional weight, because the water sort of lifted you up, and so that support wasn't needed. So in this case, for this particular group of animals, now what we're doing is we're looking at animals that have developed some sort of pretty significant type of limb or some sort of skeleton that's going to be able to support that additional weight. So the third adaptation that we're going to look at is the animal's ability to regulate its temperature. Because if you're an animal that lives in an environment that is directly influenced by air, the temperature is going to fluctuate much more rapidly than it would in water. And so animals have needed to adjust to those extreme fluctuations in temperature. And so there's going to be various physiological adaptations that we're going to look at that have sort of accommodated that change in environment. So the fourth adaptation that we're going to look at is now we have a situation where we have a variety of terrestrial habitats that are going to be available to these animals. And so this is going to allow a much greater opportunity for those animals to be able to adapt. So now because we have a group of animals that have actually sort of evolved and made their way onto land, we need to think about what structural characteristics have actually evolved in aquatic habitats that have made it possible to explore terrestrial or land-dwelling habitats. Now there's going to be two structures that are going to be connected to the pharynx that are going to be really important, that have sort of been really influential in this evolution from an aquatic environment to a land environment. And one of those is the one that you had looked at in the fish called a swim bladder. So in the swim bladder, we had sort of an air-filled cavity that, when you have an aquatic habitat, had basically functioned to allow that animal to maintain its position in the water. But in this case, we're probably looking at the cavity now being more involved in regards to respiration of that animal. Now we also had paired internal nares that in an aquatic habitat probably function primarily in chemoreception, in other words picking up stimuli from that environment. But now that we have an animal on land, we actually see a connection between those internal nares and that swim bladder. And so what's going to happen is we now have animals that have the ability to draw in oxygen-rich air through those openings or through those nares and put that oxygen-rich air into that air-filled cavity, which in most cases is going to be identified as the lung. So the second characteristic that we look at is those bony elements of those paired fins that we had seen in some of the groups of fish in that previous group that we had just talked about. As we had said in the previous screen, for animals that now live on land, you need to make sure that you have a structure that can support that weight, because again, we don't have the water sort of providing us that buoyancy nature to maintain position or to support that weight of that animal. And of course, we need a structure that's going to allow that animal to move. So these paired fins, they provided some support for the animals possibly in the water, and of course they did provide movement for those animals underwater as well. So on land, they need to provide the same function, but they need to have been adapted for the environment that these animals now inhabit. And a third adaptation for life on land, of course, is going to sort of be a combination between the skull, the teeth, the pectoral girdle, and those jointed limbs. So if you're a tetrapod, what you need to have in order to be successful on land is you need to make sure that you have a very strong backbone. And so if you look over here on the right hand side, we sort of have a couple of pictures that kind of demonstrate how these animals have evolved from the fish that we talked about in chapter 24 down to these land dwelling animals that we're going to look at in chapter 25. Now of course down here we have an iguana being represented, so of course that's not an amphibian, but it kind of gives you the idea as to what happened from this point down to this point. And that backbone had to become very strong to be able to support that weight. And in addition to having a strong backbone, you also need to have some modifications of those muscles. So again, to be able to support the body in the air. Because remember, the air is not as dense as the water. Now the muscles need to be able to elevate the head. And of course, again, because we don't have a water type of environment, the muscles are going to be responsible for that. You need to have a much stronger shoulder and hip girdle, because in this case you're going to have an animal that needs to be able to move throughout its environment, and a lot of that movement is going to be basically placed on those limbs that are found on that animal. Definitely a more protective rib cage, because we have a lot of those visceral organs that are going to be found right through this area, and you need to be able to protect those. We need to have sort of a modified ear structure to detect airborne sounds. If you remember back in chapter 24, there was only a few fish out there that actually had some special structures that could pick up those sound vibrations. And you're going to end up with a forward shortening of the skull, and you can see that right through here in this fish. It's kind of elongated skull. Then when you come down here towards the bottom where you see this iguana, the skull is definitely much, much shorter. But if you look at the snout, depending on, again, on the type of animal that we're looking at, that snout might be somewhat elongated, because again, you need to be able to pick up various scents, etc., different types of stimuli in the environment. So having a longer snout is going to help with that. Now when we talk about modern amphibians, we're going to talk about a group of animals that has about 6,000 living species, and there's going to be 3 amphibian orders that we're going to look at. Now in this case, as we sort of transition from a water environment to a land environment, the adults themselves are going to use what we consider a redesigned olfactory epithelium. So remember, olfactory is going to refer to smell, and that's going to be used to sense airborne odors. And again, as we had said before, the ear is going to be modified as well to now detect sounds that can travel through the air. But as I had said at the very beginning of the screencast, they are still tied to the water. And in most cases, they're tied to the water because the eggs themselves still need to be kept moist. They have a very, very thin shell. In fact, it's almost non-existent in some cases. And when the larvae hatch, they do depend on gills for respiration before they go through metamorphosis into the adult form. The thin skin is going to lose water rather rapidly, and so again, it's really important that these animals stay in contact with water. And you can kind of see that over here to the right-hand side with this frog that's sort of been desiccated or dried out. They are considered ectothermic, where their body temperature depends on the environment, and of course they need to be able to protect themselves from this, and so this can definitely restrict the range that they would inhabit. And the eggs, as we had said, could easily desiccate or dry out. So in most cases, they are going to be shed into the water, or they're going to be kept moist by some sort of adaptation in that animal. Now, the first group of amphibians that we're going to look at are called the Caecilians, and they belong to the order Gymnophiona. Now, there's about 173 living species of this group, and you can see a good example of this over here on the right-hand side. They kind of look like large worms or even snakes. They have an elongate, limbless body that is going to be used for burrowing, which means they have very long ribs and a terminal anus. Now, we mean terminal where instead of the anus being found, in this case, maybe down here towards the ventral part of the animal, in other words, towards the bottom, the anus is actually going to be found at the terminal point of that animal's body. Now, they do inhabit tropical forests in South America, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. They do feed primarily on worms and small underground invertebrates, so maybe various types of insects, etc. Fertilization is internal with these animals, and the male actually has what is considered a protrusible copulatory organ, which means that organ is normally hidden from view, but of course during courtship, during mating, that organ can be forced out so mating can occur. Some will deposit their eggs in the moist ground near the water, while others will actually guard them by having them develop in the folds of their body. So if you notice over here on the right hand side, we have a Sicilian that is basically guarding a group of eggs. So this doesn't really represent the group that actually will kind of store those eggs within those kind of folds of the body, but we do have some that are rather protective of their offspring until they hatch. Now, in other species, they do practice viviparity, and that's basically a situation where you have viviparous type of maternal support for those growing embryos. And so in this case, we have embryos that actually obtain nourishment from the female. Now, it's going to be a little bit different in this case because instead of actually having a connection through a placenta, the eggs will still develop within the reproductive tract of the female, but in this case, the embryos will actually eat the wall of the oviduct of that female. So that's definitely different in regards to a typical viviparous type of situation where you have an animal that has a placenta that's connected to the embryo and the mother provides nourishment to that growing embryo through that placenta. Now in this case, when the larvae do hatch, they are typically aquatic animals until they metamorphosize into the adult form. Now the second group that we're going to look at is the salamanders and the newts, and these belong to the order Caudata, or sometimes they're referred to as the Urodellans. And there's approximately 553 living species, and they're found primarily in northern temperate regions. And so when we use the word temperate, we're talking about not really a tropical rainforest or a really cold environment, but we're talking about an environment where the temperature can definitely vary. Now most are rather small, usually under 15 centimeters long, as you can see over here on the right hand side with this example, and I believe this one is, I think it might be a newt. But some others can actually become really large. If you look over here, you can see an example of a giant salamander, and some of these can get over a meter in length. Now the limbs are usually about equal length and at right angles to the trunk, and so if you notice here, we have an example, and you can see how these limbs are at right angles, which means simply that the limbs tend to protrude from the sides of the animal. Now, burrowing species and some aquatic forms definitely have lost their limbs, and so they remain primarily aquatic. So again, there's going to be some variation in this group. But in regards to feeding, these animals are carnivorous as both a larvae and an adult form. And they're going to feed on worms, small arthropods, mollusks, and they could possibly even feed on their own eggs. Now this group is a little bit different from maybe the frogs and toads that we're going to look at in a little bit, because in most cases with a frog or a toad, that group you have larvae that are actually herbivores first, and a lot of them become carnivores as adults. So in this case, both the larvae and the adults are going to be carnivores. Now they are ectotherms, and they do have a very low metabolic rate. So remember, if they're considered ectothermic, it means that the environment basically dictates the temperature of their body. Now what's really interesting about the amphibians is they have some very unique breeding behaviors. Now they do practice internal fertilization, but they have a really elaborate courtship. And the way that the female actually is inseminated or fertilized is pretty unique as well. In this case, after courtship has occurred, which actually is kind of sort of like a little dance in these animals, the female will recover the spermatophore, and we've seen that term before. So the spermatophore is just sort of like a packet of that sperm, and that packet of sperm has been deposited either on a leaf or a stick during that courtship process. And what she does is she will actually sort of run her body, and if you look down here towards the bottom, you can see this. This is the male right here. He's deposited this spermatophore right here. You can just barely see it. The female is going to basically kind of run her body over that spermatophore, and she will simply pick that up with her cloaca. And so that's a way that she becomes inseminated. So it's still considered internal fertilization. In this case, the animals really don't make contact with each other during that fertilization process. Aquatic species are going to lay their eggs in clusters or stringy masses, and so here you can see sort of an example of an aquatic type of environment that these animals will sometimes lay their eggs in. But you do have some terrestrial species that have sort of distanced themselves more from water, and they're going to deposit their eggs in a sort of a small grape-like cluster, typically under logs or in some sort of soft earth. Now again, they are amphibians, so there needs to be some sort of access to moisture even if the eggs are on land. Now, some are aquatic throughout their entire life cycle, but most will have an aquatic larvae and a terrestrial or a land-dwelling type of adult. Now, entirely terrestrial species will undergo direct development, and they simply hatch as miniature adults, which is what that word direct refers to. Now, there are some North American newts, and a newt is another type of kind of a very small salamander that do have aquatic larvae that will metamorphosize into what we consider terrestrial juveniles. And they actually have an additional molt where they're going to metamorphosize into a secondary aquatic, what we consider breeding adult. So their life cycle is a little bit different. And if you notice, we have an example of their life cycle here. And so in this case, we have adults that would be mating. So in this case, we have the mating, the behavior we had seen in the previous slide actually occurring in the water. They produce eggs, of course. These eggs are going to hatch as a gilled larvae. So they're going to respire using those gills. Then they're going to metamorphosize into a stage called a red eft. And then after a period of time, as we had said, they're going to go ahead and transform themselves into the more mature reproductive adult. Now, if you notice, it says some newt populations will actually skip the terrestrial or red F stage and actually remain entirely aquatic. Now, respiration in these animals is going to vary in the salamanders and the newts. They have what we consider extensive vascular or blood-based nets in the skin that actually are used to exchange both oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we give this a special name, and it's called cutaneous respiration. The word cutaneous refers to skin. Sometimes we refer to them as skin breathers. At various stages, they may also have external gills, lungs, or they could actually have both gills and lungs, or they could have neither and simply respire through their skin. So it depends on the type of salamander or newt that you're referring to. Salamanders with an aquatic stage are going to hatch with gills, and you can see these gills right over here, which are going to be lost as they metamorphosize. But as we had said, if they do remain aquatic, those gills are going to remain. Several diverse lineages fail to undergo metamorphosis, and they do retain their gills and a fin-like tail. And you can see that fin-like tail right here. So it's kind of a remnant of the fish that we had talked about back in chapter 24. In those species that do have lungs, lungs are usually present from birth, and they do become functional following metamorphosis. So they're actually always there, but at some point in their life, maybe they use the gills for respiration, but then as they metamorphosize, then the lungs will become more functional. All right, so that's going to finish up our first screencast for chapter 25. As always, please make sure that you have completed your screencast study guide before you come to class.